So this is technically part one of the video series, and I wanted to talk about basically just the way my father was diagnosed. My father was diagnosed in November of 2014. I would say the day before Halloween, my father came down with what we thought was the flu. He was laying in bed, he was sick to his stomach, he couldn't eat, he didn't drink much anyway, but we were having an even harder time getting him to drink. He pretty much just spent the day in bed. Every time he got up, he seemed to have an awful time balancing. He said he wasn't dizzy, but he just sort of had a tough time balancing himself. Halloween came, he seemed to get a little bit worse. My mother did try to talk him into going to an urgent care, just to, make sure that everything was okay. If he did have the flu, maybe he should get some Tamiflu, whatever the case may be. He absolutely refused. That, unfortunately, was the way of my father. Unless he had a limb hanging off, he wasn't going to the doctor. So he turned it down. We had our Halloween festivities. Me and my mom like to dress up for Halloween, and we hand out candy and stuff. It's just fun. So we went ahead and we did that, and he stayed in bed. And the dizziness, not dizziness, but the inability to balance himself continued on through that day. So the next night, which would be November 1st, that next evening my father came out, and he was borrowing a walker that we had in the house from when my mom had knee surgery. And he came out and he said to us, "I think I need to go to the emergency room." So we said, okay. We piled him into the car. We went down to the emergency room. And it was just one of the bigger hospitals in the area, and we were familiar with it because my mom had had her knee surgery and he had had his heart surgery several years prior at this particular hospital. So we pull in and we go into the emergency room, and we tell him, his symptoms. At this point, he's his regular self. We were, there was a drunk woman screaming and assaulting the police, a little bit down the hall, and, we were laughing and stuff like that. So he was still his normal, regular, everyday self at this point. So he tells the doctor that came in, what his, what he was experiencing. And they were asking him questions about not being able to balance, and, was he dizzy, and no, and, things like that. And apparently that particular part of it is what concerned them. So they came back in a little while later. We were there for quite a while. And they came back in, and they told my father, what we suspect may be wrong, we can't handle here. So we're going to transfer you to another hospital. And we're going to do that right now. There's an ambulance outside waiting. So now at this point we're freaking out because they're transferring him to another hospital because whatever he has, they can't deal with. And we're like, well, what does he have? What's the problem? And they said, well, we're not really sure as of right now, and we don't want to scare anybody. Let's just take him to the hospital where they have, better resources than we have, and we'll find out what it is. So they packed him up, they put him in an ambulance, and they drove him out to this other hospital. Me and my mom immediately got in our car, and we drove out to meet them at the hospital. So they ran a bunch of tests. We were there most of the night. They ran a bunch of tests and everything. I ended up going home. This, unfortunately, is where it starts to get a little blurry in this particular area of the story. So I'm just going to skip ahead and tell you they went ahead and they diagnosed him with Glioblastoma multiforme stage 4. So we now had the daunting task of figuring out what that meant. So we found out that it was, it was a brain cancer. It was very aggressive, and his tumor was actually at the base of his brain. And the way the tumor was, it was actually, his was golf ball sized. So that's actually a fairly large tumor for a brain. So he had this golf ball sized tumor in the back of his head on his brain, and it had these tentacles that came out of it, and they were starting to spread through his brain, like just traveling around, and they had started to go down his brain stem, which is what was causing the balance issues. So they told my father, they said, well, we need to perform surgery to take the tumor out. And he said, okay, well, when are we going to schedule this for? And the doctor said, well, pretty much this afternoon. So it was an emergency situation. So we wished him luck, the whole 9 yards. They wheeled my father in, and they did the surgery. And unfortunately, that was the last time my father was my father. Everything went to hell at that point in time. He came back out from his surgery. Still heavily medicated. He was a little bit loopy. We stayed with him for as long as we could, and then we ended up having to go home because we were restricted by visiting hours, especially with ICU. Sometime in the middle of the night, we got a call from the hospital, and my mom's freaking out. It was close to being early morning, but it was still the middle of the night. Apparently, my father had a negative reaction, and they weren't sure if it was from the surgery or if it was from the medication. He was yelling about the Taliban. I don't know why the Taliban in particular. My father's war was Vietnam, so I don't know why he was yelling about the Taliban. But he, for whatever reason, thought that he had been captured by the Taliban and they were trying to get information out of him. Which, on the surface, could probably elicit a giggle or two, except for the fact that he had literally picked up a nurse and threw her. She was actually thrown out of the room. She's fine. She didn't get hurt, but it obviously rattled them. It took several of them to hold him down while they sedated him. And they called my mother to come up immediately. So she did. She came up, and I went up with her, and we spent a long time in the hospital. There wasn't a whole lot we could do, but they had to fill my mom in to let her know what had happened. Several days later, they released my father from the hospital, and he came home. At this point, this is where things really started to change. His personality began to change, and it was like the blink of an eye. It was so fast. It was like 1 minute he was his old self, and then the next minute he was like... So let's go into part 2, and I will talk about some of the changes in his personality and some of the stuff that happened at home. This one's going to be a fun one.